This subwoofer is a hidden gem. It's supposed to be one of the best sound quality subwoofers on the market. I've got two of them. Let's build a box. But not just any box. This one's gonna have some really cool stuff, so keep watching. You don't wanna miss any of it. As always, the process starts by modeling the enclosure in WinISD and drawing up some plans in SketchUp. I'll be sure to put a link to those plans along with a link to the subwoofers, the ports, and everything else you're gonna need for this build down in the video description. Hey, once all the computer work is done, it's time to head over to the table saw and break down the sheet goods. Now there is a method you can use to ensure a tight-fitting enclosure even if your measurements are not perfectly accurate. More on that later in the video. You may have noticed that I'm using a mixture of MDF and plywood. That's because I'm trying to use up some scrap material from previous projects. Before you go any further, now's a good time to do a dry fit and make sure everything, well, you know, fits. This design calls for a pair of 3-inch precision ports. So in addition to the normal brace down the middle of the box, it's also going to have a support for the ports. Now it's time for the cool part. If you've been watching this channel, you know that I've been trying to up my game because a good box needs to both look good and sound good. And thanks to the generous support of patrons like Bo, Dylan, Fargo, Gaddy, JD America, Baba, all these guys whose names are scrolling across the bottom of the screen, and the rest of the Patreon crew, I was able to invest in some of these templates, plus this nifty car audio fabrication material gap tool set. Let me tell you, these things are not cheap. If you want to see more gear like this in action, head over to Patreon and you can support the channel for as little as $3 a month. And I really do appreciate the help. My goal here is to make this shape right here by combining some circle templates with some straight templates. Then the plan is to make a trim ring using the material gap tool. The insert ring is going to be wrapped in vinyl and that will pressure fit against carpet. The idea here is to alternate colors. I'm going to use a charcoal gray carpet on the enclosure. That's going to transition to black vinyl on the trim ring, then gray vinyl on the subwoofer baffle, and then finally the black subwoofer. These subwoofers are Dayton Audio reference drivers. They've got this cool aluminum cone which gives them a very distinctive look.
Very distinctive style.
So let's get to work. Step one, grab some measuring tools. This thing here is called a combination square. So here I'm laying out the location of the subwoofers on the inner baffle. The plan is to oversize the cutouts on the outer baffle so that I can recess the drivers. For the speaker cutouts and to lay out the recess, I'm going to use some of these rings right here. The last time I used these rings in a video, several people jumped in the comments and said that I should be using a circle jig instead. I've got a circle jig. I actually prefer using the rings because I can use the router table behind me and that router table has better dust collection. After everything is laid out, it's just a matter of sticking the rings to the baffles and routing out the speaker cutouts. If you want, you can rough cut this with a jigsaw first. I opted to skip that step this time, and I can definitely hear the router struggling to get through all of that material in one pass. So I do recommend taking the extra time and doing that rough cut with a jigsaw. This is a 1/4-inch spiral cut flush trim bit. When you buy your first router, you're probably also gonna go ahead and pick up a set of inexpensive router bits. These things are great to get started. But if you're gonna do any of this template routing, go ahead and drop some cash on some quality flush trim bits. I've had good luck with white side bits. Off camera, I used some double-sided tape to attach the outer baffle to the inner baffle. Now the inner baffle serves as a template for the outer baffle. There are two advantages to doing it this way. First, if my measurements were a little bit off, when I set up that inner baffle, I'm gonna have a perfect copy of that and everything's still going to line up. And second, you only have to spend time laying out locations on that inner baffle. If you wanted to, you can set these aside for now, but I'm gonna go through another step. I want to recess that driver. I just like the way it looks. It's not something that you have to do. And for that step, I'm going to be cutting a rabbet into the outer baffle, which means I've got to change the router bit. And what that does is create this lip that allows me to trim this hole out so it'll fit around the outside of the subwoofer. To do that, we need to install a flush trim bit. And right here, both my cameras died, and so I didn't get this part on film, but here are the finished baffles. And now's a good time to do a test fit. If it's wrong, you want to know about it now, not after you finish putting everything together. All that was step one. Now it's time for step two. My goal here is to make this shape right here by combining some circle templates with some straight templates. I'm gonna make that shape on some 1/2" MDF that I've got left over from another project. For these initial stages of this step, it would probably make better sense to use some thinner material. Thinner material is cheaper and it's easier to cut. We'll begin this stage by tracing out the subwoofer cutouts onto that 1/2" material. You need to know where the drivers are gonna be at so that your design elements don't interfere with the subwoofers. Another affordable and useful tool is a speed square. You can literally pick these up for just a few bucks. And most of them are gonna have indents where the markings are. You just stick a pencil into, say in this case, the 1" indent, and you can quickly mark out lines that are parallel to the edges. If you're doing this for yourself, you can make any design that you want by combining arcs and circles and straight pieces. You don't even really need to go out and buy all these templates. You can use scrap material from previous projects. Off camera, I rough cut the shape with a jigsaw and tape down some template. You'll notice that the circle template is sitting on top of the straight template. So to route this out, you need to use a bit with multiple bearings. In the last step, I used a bit with a single bearing, so I had to swap out the bit. If I had just started out with this bit, I could have saved myself a couple of minutes. So if you're doing this yourself, take some time to plan a few steps ahead. This process requires several different router bits, and 10 minutes of planning might save you 30 minutes of work. So my outer template shape is now finished. I'm gonna grab a piece of MDF and transfer it to that piece of MDF. Now I could have just used these plastic template shapes to do the step I'm about to do and added an extra step because I wanted to save this piece right here and have it in case I mess something up later on in the process. This is like saving your game before you start the boss fight. When I get finished transferring this template, I'll have an inner shape and an outer shape. Then I can use the material gap tool to resize the inner shape so that I get a good fit between the carpet and the vinyl. Off camera, I drilled a 1/4" starter hole so that I could use this 1/4" flush trim bit. And you know what that means? I've got to change the bit again. Looking back over the footage, now I realize I could have used this 1/4" flush trim bit for the last 3 cuts. And now I understand why Mark has 3 routers. If I had a multiple router setup, I could just leave this in one of the routers so it's there anytime that I need it, and that would have saved a ton of time. Now I made a small mistake and I ended up with a big gash right here where I started the cut. If you're gonna be a DIYer, you're gonna make mistakes. You just have to learn how to roll with them.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
Instead of starting over, just grab some Bondo and fill in that gash. Now this piece right here is not gonna be big enough for it to press fit into place later on. So you've got to go through some steps to get it sized exactly right. The first part of that process is to take the insert shape and oversize it by 1/4 inch all the way around. You're doing this to add back the material that your 1/4" bit just removed. For that, you've got to start by changing the router bit. With the bit in place and that inner piece taped down, you set that oversized bearing so that it rides on that inside piece and start cutting. Now that this piece has been upsized, you have to downsize. Now this tool set came with this bit that's designed to make some very small rabbets. You start by installing this router bit, making a cut, flipping it over, making a cut, flipping it over, and you do that until you get the shape reduced to the size that you need. It's probably a good idea to keep a tally of your cuts. It would really suck to find out that you miscounted later on when you try to wrap this piece in vinyl. And when you finish cutting all those rabbets, you need to trim the last one flush. Guess what that means? Then you've got to change the router bit. Okay, this is taking a while, but technically we're still on step 2. Here's what we've done so far. We've got an outer trim piece that's going to be wrapped in carpet after it's attached to the enclosure. Then we have an inner insert piece, and that piece needs to be transformed into a ring. Before you do that, I recommend making a copy of this piece right here. Again, save the game before the next boss fight. So tape that precisely sized insert piece to a fresh piece of MDF and hit it with that flush trim bit. Thankfully, I still have the flush trim bit in the router, so I don't have to change the bit. Let me take a second to say thank you to this video's sponsor, MaxPowerAudio.com. Be sure to check out MaxPowerAudio.com, where they sell the most powerful car audio gear available today. All of their gear is certified for max power, 100% total harmonic distortion, and a pure square wave for perfect clipping. Certified by Max Power's team of engineers, because at Max Power Audio, the numbers don't lie, but we do. Up to this point, everything that I've made could have been made with 1/4 inch material. That would save money and it's a lot easier to cut. But this piece here needs to be 1/2 inch material or maybe even thicker. Here's why. When you finish copying that piece, you need to cut a rabbet. And you know what that means, don't you? I've got to change the router bit. After you cut the rabbet, guess what? Change the router bit again so you can trim it out with your 1/4 inch flush trim bit. Here I've drilled a 1/4 inch hole and inserted a 1/4 inch flush trim bit in that hole. When I'm done with this, I'll have a ring that I can use as an insert. Well, not really, but what I will have is a very thin and very flimsy piece of MDF that I can use as a template. I can then transfer that shape to another piece of MDF and use an oversized bearing to oversize it. Well, I could do that, but instead I need to go back to my last save point and start over because I screwed this step up. If it were just a few minor bumps and divots, I could have busted out the Bondo, but it was pretty bad. Unfortunately, that means 2 extra bit swaps. After going back to fix that mistake, I am ready to move on. Now you have to oversize that piece, and for that, you've got to start by changing the router bit. To make this a little bit easier to cut on the router, I'm going to use a bearing to mark out a cut line, and then rough cut that with a jigsaw. The process here is the same. You grab some double-side tape, you stick the template to the piece that will become the insert, and you run the bearing along the template. And at this stage, we have all of our parts cut out for the front of the enclosure. There's an inner baffle, an outer trim ring, and an inner trim ring. But we're not done yet. The inner ring has a few imperfections. I'll fix that with some Bondo off camera. The outer ring is 1/2 inch material. I want to transfer that to some 3/4 inch material. Now, if I would have been thinking ahead, I would have done this step when I had the flush trim bit installed earlier, but I didn't. So now I need to change router bits. And it was at this point in the build that I realized that all of these router bit changeouts were killing my productivity. So I took a second to look around and see if there was anything else that needed a flush trim, like the brace and the port cutouts. Well, now's a good time to take care of that while the bit is in the router. But lo and behold, the brace needed one of those double bearing bits, and I had installed the single bearing bit instead. For the next step, we need a roundover. To do that, you have to change the router bit. Now I'm finally beginning to wise up. I went ahead and took care of the roundover on the outer trim ring and the outer baffle while I had the roundover bit installed. I also want to put a roundover on the inside edge of that trim ring, but this 1/2 inch bit is just a little bit too aggressive, so I need a smaller roundover. To make that smaller roundover, I have to change the router bit. Now we need to cut a rabbet. To do that, you have to change the router bit. I'm going to put a rabbet on the underside of the outer trim ring and then 2 rabbets on the underside of the inner trim ring. I also need a rabbet on the end pieces of the enclosure. All of that is done in order to make it easier to wrap the box in carpet and vinyl later on in the build. So that is the end of step 2. Step 2 is finally complete. Before we move on to the next step, here's my first impression of this Car Audio Fabrication Material Gap tool. So far it works exactly as described. I won't know for sure how it's going to turn out until I finish wrapping all the pieces, and at that point I'll see how well this trim ring fits. But there are 2 downsides. First, as you have just seen, this was a very time-consuming process. Making a box like this is a lot of work. I now have a whole lot more respect for the people who do this kind of thing for a living, and I understand why shops charge through the nose for this kind of enclosure. Now, even though it was time-consuming, I made a bunch of mistakes. I'm certain that I'll get faster with practice, and hey, I bet adding a second or even a third router will make a huge difference in my productivity. Which brings me to the second drawback. These bits and templates, man, they are not cheap. Let me be really clear about what I mean here. No single individual part in this setup is really all that expensive, but all these templates and bits comprise a system and they're all intended to be used together. In fact, all of this stuff right here set me back close to 900 bucks. And at that point, you start to think that there might be a better way. Just to see what would happen, I fired up the laser and I cut some 1/4 inch material and made an inner and outer template. Now that laser is not the ultimate solution, Right now I'm limited to about a 15 by 15 cutting area, but for some extra money, Xtool will sell you some extended rails for the laser, and that'll kick you up to about a 15 by 30 cutting area. I'll explore using the laser to cut out custom templates for an individual project at some point in the future, but for now I've got to get this project finished. Click right here to catch that video when I get it uploaded. In the meantime, check out this video right over here and I will show you the process for breaking down your sheet goods so that your box will always fit together perfect no matter what. I'm Justin, this is the DIY Audio Guy YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.